Hello and welcome to this section of the Algebra Tutor. In this section we're going to tackle something incredibly important, and that is called how to add and subtract real numbers. Now don't forget, a real number in math is basically just a broad term that means lots of numbers. Negative numbers, positive numbers, and everything in between, and we have talked about that before. So what we're going to be doing in this section basically is learning how to add and subtract negative and positive numbers. And I have to say, it is really at this point that a lot of students start to have problems with algebra. Because, when you're in second grade, you learn how to add and subtract. It's not a big deal. It's not hard. You learn how to multiply and divide. It's not hard. It's okay. And then suddenly you get to algebra or pre-algebra and you start talking about these negative numbers and it confuses people. And so that's when a lot of students start to have some basic problems, and then they try to punch through it and go on to the next section and quickly realize that you can't get anywhere in algebra unless you know how to deal with these negative numbers. So make sure when you watch this material here that you not only watch it, but that you truly understand what it's doing and you can do it for yourself. Because I can promise you, if you spend an extra 20 or 30 minutes or an extra hour learning this and practicing this, then when we get into equations, when we get into other things later, it's not going to be a big deal because you already understand how to handle it. So a lot of what we're going to do here is review second grade math, first grade math, how to add, subtract. And we're just going to add the twist of what a negative number is. Now, for those of you who are watching this that are a little bit confused as to what a negative number really is, let's give a little bit of a refresher. Here in my hand, I have one pencil or one pen. And if I grab another guy, I have two markers, right? These are two markers in my hand. So we call that number 2. This is something you've dealt with all the time. 2 jelly beans, 2 pencils, 2 markers, right? But what you haven't really totally said out loud to yourself is really this is called positive 2, right? Anything you have is a positive number. And that's just from first grade or from kindergarten. If you have 10 cars, it's really called positive 10. If you have 3 houses, it's positive 3 houses, right? Now, if I don't have these guys, but I actually owe you something, right? If you are a second person standing next to me and I actually owe you some of these pens, right? Then I don't have, let's say I owe you 2 pens. I don't actually have 2 pens, but I keep track of the fact that I owe you 2 pens by calling it negative 2. That's one very easy way to talk about the difference between positive and negative. When I have positive 2 of something, it means I have them in my hand. If I have negative 3 paper clips, it means I don't have any paper clips. I actually owe somebody else paper clips. The negative just kind of keeps track of the fact that I don't own those. I kind of owe that to you. So if you buy a house for so much money, then you kind of have negative because you owe the bank that much money. It's not money you have, it's money you owe someone else. So that's what really a negative number is. So when we start adding positive and negative numbers together, we're combining those two concepts together. So there are a few simple rules that we can deal with when we're adding positive and negative numbers together. And let's write these here. What I'm going to do is write the rules down. They're very simple. I'm going to put them up here. And we're going to do a lot of practice here, all right? We're going to do so many problems that you're going to start to go a little bit cross-eyed, but make sure you understand them all because practice is the only way you can get good at this stuff. So let's start off with things that I know that you will know. If we're adding numbers together, then a positive number, when we add it to another positive number, that's what the pluses mean. We have a positive number and we add it to another positive number. What we are definitely going to get is a positive number back. This is something you already know. 2 pencils plus 2 pencils is 4 pencils. Each number is positive. This is something you already know from your basic elementary school. Positive 2 pencils plus positive 2 pencils is positive 4 pencils. 2 plus 2 is 4. So when you have a positive number and you're adding it to a positive number, then you do it exactly as you've always done addition, your whole life. So that's not anything new. Now let's look at a different case. Let's say I have a negative number and I'm adding it to another negative number. What am I going to get? What is the sign of the answer going to be? The sign of the answer in that case is going to be negative. Negative plus negative is always going to give you negative. These are things that are always true. If you have a positive number and you add it to a positive number, you will always get a positive answer. If you have a negative number and you add it to another negative number, you will always get a negative number. And if you think about it, that kind of makes sense, because if you think about negative numbers as owing somebody, let's say I owe this person $5, okay? And then I also owe this other person $5 more. How much do I owe altogether? Well, -5 plus -5. I mean, if I owe this guy money and I owe this person money, then altogether I should owe somebody more money. 5 plus 5, $10. I'm going to owe $10 altogether. That would be -10. So when I owe somebody and I add it to something else I owe, the resulting answer should always be negative, because I'm still going to owe people money altogether when I add them together. And that's always true of negative numbers. When you take a negative and you add it to another negative, you're always going to get a negative number. So you see, these two are super easy. These are so easy to understand. This first one is what you already know from first grade. The second one, yeah, you have to talk about negative numbers a little, but once you get that, you can understand that if I owe somebody money, I owe this guy money, I owe this guy money, I owe this guy money, these are all negative numbers. If I add them together, I'm going to owe all these people the sum of that, which is going to be negative, because I have a net that I owe people. The only time that it gets a little bit interesting is when I'm adding together a positive with a negative, okay? Maybe I've got +3 plus -2, or +1 plus -6, or something like that. If I take a positive number and I'm trying to add to it a negative number. And the answer, as far as what the sign is going to be, is it could be positive, it could be negative. And you don't know until you look at the specific problem. And that's all I'm really going to say here, because you're going to get this through a lot of examples. I'm going to show you how to determine the answer. But the bottom line is, folks, these are the rules of adding and subtracting real numbers. And that's it. There's nothing else to it. If you're adding a positive number to a positive number, you're always going to get a positive number. If you're adding a negative number to a negative number, you're always going to get a negative number. And if the signs are different, right, positive plus negative, or if it's negative plus positive, if the signs are different and you're adding them together, then the answer could be either one, positive or negative, and that's just going to depend on the problem. And I'm going to show you how to figure that out in a bulletproof way. So this is how we're going to do it. So let's go ahead and start to apply some of this stuff, and we're going to work our way up. Let's talk about an easy problem. Let's say we have 4 plus 8. What is that going to equal? Well, this is from, second grade math, right? This is a positive number plus a positive number. The signs of these guys are the same, positive and positive. They're both positive, so the answer we know is going to be positive. What do you think the answer is? 8 plus 4. You know that is going to be 12, and it's a positive number because from common sense, right? 4 pencils plus 8 pencils is going to give us 12 pencils, but also from our rules up here, positive plus positive is always going to give us positive, right? So that's pretty simple. All right, now let's do a slightly different problem. What if we have -3 plus -7? Now I'm putting them in parentheses, mostly to not confuse you. If I take the parentheses away, then you might confuse the plus with the negative here. So right now I'm just wrapping it in parentheses to tell you you have -3 and you're adding to it -7. And so you look up here and you say, well, negative with another negative, you add them together, you always get a negative answer. So you know right off the bat that you're going to have a negative answer. What do you think this answer is going to be? If I have 3 pencils and it's negative, what does that mean? It means I don't actually have 3 pencils. I owe someone else 3 pencils. Same thing here. I don't actually have 7 pencils. I owe someone else 7 pencils. So altogether, how much do I owe? Well, it's going to be 3 plus 7. That's going to be 10 pencils. But it's not positive 10 because I don't actually have these. It's -10. The negative means I owe, altogether, I owe someone, or all these people, I owe them altogether 10 pencils. The negative takes care of helping us remember that. So the short answer is, by looking at these two examples, the way you handle addition in algebra, basically, if the sign of the numbers are the same, in this case they're both positive, you just add the numbers together. You get 12. And the sign of the answer is always going to be positive, because positive plus positive is positive, just according to our rule. If you're adding two negative numbers, you still add the numbers together, 3 plus 7, giving us 10, but the sign is negative because negative plus negative always gives us negative. So the bottom line is, if the sign of our numbers are the same, we just add the numbers together. That's all we do. I mean, this is first grade math. If the sign of these numbers are the same, we add them together. The sign, we have to kind of look at what we're doing here. These are both negative, So according to this rule, it's going to be negative. Okay? And another way to look at this, another way to visualize this, is to look at our number line. Okay? Because this is something we're not going to do for every problem, but it's something that can be nice to look at. Let's say this is 0, and the positive numbers are going off to the right, positive 1, positive 2, positive 3, and so on. But here I have negative 1, negative 2, negative 3, negative 4, negative 5, negative 6, negative 7, negative 8, negative 9, negative 10, negative 11, negative 12, negative 13, negative 14, and so on. All right, so the way this would be negative 4, negative 5, negative 6, negative 7, negative 8, negative 9, negative 10, negative 11, like that. So how do we represent the subtraction? Well, when we have negative 3 plus negative 7, right, that means that we start at negative 3, because that's the first number. So we're starting here at negative 3, which is the left-hand side of 0, and we're adding to it not a positive number, we're adding to it actually a negative number. In other words, we're taking away more. So if we owe somebody 3 pencils and we owe somebody else 7 more, then we owe people more, so we have to go more left because we're digging ourselves deeper into the hole, so to speak, of owing people. So we owe somebody 7 more. So we count to the left. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and we land on negative 10, which is what was our answer. So when you add negative numbers, you're going to the left on the number line. If you add positive numbers, you're going to the right on the number line. So the answer is negative 10. It matches what we got. Now this number line business is useful. It's great to represent and to learn, but it's not good when you're solving lots of algebra problems because you don't want to draw a number line all the time. But it's nice to kind of represent it. So occasionally we'll draw it on the board to kind of help illustrate. All right, so let's go ahead and continue working some more. We've only done a couple of these guys. We're going to do a lot so that you get very comfortable with what we're doing. Here we have done positive plus positive give us positive. Here we've done negative plus negative gives us negative. Here's going to be our first problem where we're going to do 6 plus negative 4. So see, this is different than all the other ones because we have a positive and we're adding to it a negative number. So here we look up here and we see, okay, if we have different signs, then the answer could be either one. And I told you a minute ago, I'll show you how to figure that out. Let me show you how to do it. The bottom line is, if you're adding together two numbers that have different signs like this, okay, different signs like this, then what you do is you kind of forget about this sign for just a second, and you subtract these numbers from one another. So 6 minus 4, let me switch over here, is going to give you 2. Okay, that's going to be the number. Now to get the actual sign, I told you it could be plus or minus. To get the sign, all you do is you look at the two numbers you were dealing with and you figure out which one's larger in terms of absolute value. Well, I have a 6 here and I have a negative 4 here. So the larger number, as far as absolute value goes, is 6. This one, and this one's positive. And the answer basically takes the same sign as the larger number, the larger absolute value number. So the answer is positive 2. So again, I've just taught you without writing a definition down how to do this addition when you have different signs of numbers. If you have different signs, in this case positive plus negative, you always just subtract the numbers. You forget about the sign for a second. You subtract the numbers, get the answer, and the sign takes the same sign as the larger number, the larger absolute value number. Let's do a couple more, and you'll see how this works. It's actually very simple. I've seen books explain this lots of ways. I really do believe this is the easiest way to do it. Let's say 9 plus negative 11. All right, so here we have a positive plus a negative. We have different signs of our numbers. So what you do is you forget about the sign for a second, and you subtract these numbers in the way that you did from first grade. So we have 11, and we subtract 9. You just basically take the bigger number and subtract the smaller. So forget about that. 11 minus 9 would be 2. And then to figure out what the sign is, you look at what you had, and you figure out what was the bigger number absolute value-wise. Well, I have a negative 11. I have a positive 9. This is the larger number in terms of absolute value. So it takes a negative sign. And that's a negative 2. Okay, so again, you forget about the sign, subtract the numbers, get your number, And then to get the sign, you kind of go back and look at whichever one was biggest as far as the absolute value. In other words, which one had the largest number here, not taking into account the sign, and then the answer is going to match that sign, basically. Now again, we're not going to do this for every problem, but we'll go ahead and do this guy on the number line to show you what's going on here. So if I have a number line, something like this, then my 0 point might be here, all right? And then I might have, you know, -1, -2, something like this. And then I might have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So let me label these guys real quick. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So how would we represent this addition? Well, we start at the number 9. So we look ahead. Here is the number 9 right here. And we're adding to it a negative number. So because we're adding negative, we kind of go to the left on the number line. Okay? If we're adding positive number, we go to the right and we get bigger. But since we're adding a negative number, we go to the left 11 units. So count with me. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. 11 units to the left, the answer we get is -2. And that matches with everything. So you see, you could draw a number line here for every problem, but it gets cumbersome after a while. What if I gave you, you know, -154 minus, you know, 3 or minus 25? Well then, to write that on a number line is a real pain. What if I gave you 1/2 minus 3/4? Then you have to write fractions on a number line. So you really need to learn the rules, and that's going to help you get faster, faster, faster. And we're going to do a lot more problems to show you that. So again, let me recap here before we go on and solve some more problems. Positive number plus positive number always gives you a positive number. Negative number plus negative number always gives you a negative number. You just simply add the absolute values here, okay, to get the number. If you have mixed, where you're adding positive to negative, and also if you flipped it around negative to positive, it's the same thing. You ignore the sign, you always subtract these guys. You got the 2 here, you always subtract these guys. 11 minus 9, you always get the 2 here. The sign of the answer is going to match the sign of whatever is larger on this side as far as absolute value goes. So we have a positive here because this one's bigger, and we have a negative here because this one is bigger. Now, one final thing I want to say before I go on to the final section, or I should say to the rest of our problems, is sort of an aside. I want you to start thinking about it as we go along. It'll help you if you start realizing this a little bit sooner rather than later. Okay, what we can do, you don't have to do this, but I want to make sure you understand. Here we have 3 plus a -7. And I'm writing it this way to be clear, right? Because I'm adding a negative number. But this can be written exactly as -3 minus 7. These two things are the same thing. Basically, anytime you see plus a negative like this, plus negative, in that order, plus a negative, you can just kind of forget about that plus sign and write it as minus. So -3 minus 7. Same thing as over here. This guy right here, let me draw a little arrow. See, I have a plus minus. I can write this as 6 minus 4. And it's exactly the same thing. Same thing here, I have plus minus. Let me go ahead and write that over here. Like that. Here as 9, I can write it as 9 minus 11. So if you see on a piece of paper -3 plus 7, then you can, in your head, you can look at it this way. If you see something like this, you can look at it this way. The reverse is true. If you see 6 minus 4, you can always write it as 6 plus a -4. In my opinion, early on, it's easier to watch and view it in terms of the way I'm writing it here, but in your book, you're going to quickly be able to start seeing things like this, and you're going to be expected to know that these are the same thing. Notice that it is the same thing. If I start with 6 units of something, right, 6 pencils, and I subtract 4 away, right, the answer is 2. That comes from first grade math. That's exactly what I get. But if I start out with 9 pencils and I try to subtract 11, well, I'm going to get to 0, but then I'm going to have to subtract 2 more, so I'm going to get -2, and that was our answer. So writing it like this is exactly the same as writing it like this. The bottom line is anytime you see plus a negative, you can always write that as just subtraction. And you can do the reverse, whatever's easier for you to remember. So let's go ahead and continue working some examples. What we're going to do now, I've spent a lot of time showing you and talking and talking and talking and talking for every example. What we're going to do now is just bury this in your mind as far as being just absolutely on the tip of your tongue. So we're going to work a lot of problems here. Feel free to pause the video after I put a problem on the board, try to work it out for yourself, and then press play and see if you can get the answer, because you can watch this all day, but until you can do it yourself, it's kind of meaningless. So let's go ahead and do this here. We're going to do a lot rapid fire. I'm going to erase the board, and we're going to do a lot of these problems rapid fire to make sure you fully understand this concept. All right, so let's get started. What we have here is -5 plus -7. All right, so we have a negative number. We're adding to it another negative number. So we know the answer is negative because of this rule here, so we can always just stick that there. The way we get the answer is by adding these numbers together. So when the signs are the same, in this case they're both negative, we add these numbers. 7 plus 5 is going to give us 12, so the answer is -12. The negative comes because we're adding two of these things together. Here we started by owing somebody 5 cards. We owe somebody else 7 more cards. Altogether, we owe all these people 12 cards. That's why it's -12. All right, let's go and do something like -0.4 plus 0.9. I'm trying to show you that it doesn't matter if they're whole numbers or decimals or whatever, the exact same thing applies. Here I have a negative number and I'm adding to it a positive number. So the signs are different. Because the signs are different, the answer I'm going to get could be either answer. How do you do it? If the signs are different, you forget about the sign for a second, you subtract the numbers. This subtraction, 0.9 minus 0.4, is going to give you 0.5. And the sign of the answer is always going to take the sign of whatever number is larger. So here, 0.9, as far as absolute value goes, is bigger than this guy, so the answer is going to be positive. So the answer is positive 0.5. So you see we can get very fast at doing this once we know how to do it. Let's take something a little more complicated. 5 plus, I'll open a bracket up, 4 plus -2. Okay, so how do we do this? So now we have to kind of use order of operations on top of what we learned today. We've already learned order of operations. We always do what's inside of the brackets or the parentheses first. So one easy way to do that, if you want, on your paper, you can literally just kind of draw a little brace like that and figure out what's inside of here first. What is 4 plus a -2? Well, the signs are different. So because the signs are different, you forget about the sign for a second, and you subtract the numbers. 4 minus 2 is 2, and the sign here is going to take the sign of the bigger number. This is the bigger number, so we just keep it as 2 out there. So ultimately it's 5 plus 2 because this is the answer to what's inside of there. 5 plus 2, positive plus positive, is always going to give us positive, so the answer is 7. All right, let's move on down the line and do something different. Let's say we have -2 plus, we'll open a parentheses, -4 plus 5. Well, again, since we have parentheses, we have to do what's inside the parentheses first. If we don't, we're going to get the wrong answer. So what is this guy? So we focus on this, -4 plus 5. The signs are different. Because the signs are different, what we do is we forget about this sign. We subtract these numbers going from big to small. So 5 minus 4 is just 1. And the sign of the answer takes the sign of whichever is larger. This guy is larger, so this is positive 1. So inside of here what we have is -2 plus a positive 1, so -2 plus 1. And now we have to do this problem. So now again we are adding things that have different signs. So since they're different signs, we cover this up, forget about it. 2 minus 1 gives us 1, and we take the sign of the larger number. This is the larger number, so the answer is -1. All right? The answer is -1. And notice, just to kind of give you a little bit more practice, in this last step we had -2 plus 1. You could rewrite this as 1 plus -2. Don't you agree? I mean, all we did was flip it around. So -2 plus 1 is the same as 1 plus a -2. And I already told you before that anytime you have plus minus, you can write it as just minus. So really what we're saying is -2 plus 1, we have the answer, that's fine, but I'm just showing you, this is the same thing as 1 minus 2. We're doing it basically the same thing. It's exactly the same thing as 1 minus 2. Now, if you think about this for a second, if I have one pencil in my hand, this is positive 1, if I have one pencil in my hand, but I actually owe somebody 2 pencils, that's what the negative 2 means, or if I take away 2 pencils, you can think of it that way. One pencil in my hand, this pen right here, but I subtract 2, well, the first one's gone. I can't take any more away. I must owe somebody 1 more pencil, because I took 1 away, but I had to take 2 away from my problem, so I actually owe somebody 1 pencil in the end, and that's why the answer is negative 1. So thinking of negative numbers in terms of owing things is a pretty good idea in my opinion. So let me go ahead and erase this and we'll work some more to continue building your skills. All right, so let's continue building up our complexity a little bit. Negative 4 plus negative 3. All right, and then the next bracket is 2 plus negative 2, like this. All right, so from our rules of operation, we know we can't just ignore these brackets. We have to do what's inside of them first. So what we're going to do is find out what the answer to the inside of this is, get it right here, and we're going to find out to the answer of what's inside here, and we're going to get that. Then finally we can add those two results together. So first we look at this guy, and we realize negative 4 plus a negative 3. We're adding things together with the same sign, and that sign's negative. So the answer is always going to be negative. And the way we get it is by adding the absolute values. 4 plus 3 is 7. So inside here we have negative 7. We owe somebody 4 paper clips. We owe somebody else 3 more paper clips. So if we owe 4 and then we owe 3 more, we must owe altogether 7 paper clips. So that makes sense. Over here, we're adding things together with different signs. So we cover this up, we subtract, we get 2 minus 2 is 0, and it doesn't really matter since it's 0. You normally would take the sign of the larger number, but both of these numbers are the same. So for 0, it doesn't matter. Once you get 0, it's the same thing. And if you look at this, 2 plus a negative 2 is the same thing as 2 minus 2. 2 minus 2 is 0. So once you get 0, you're just stuck with it. And then finally what you have here is negative 7 plus 0. Anything plus 0 is itself. So the answer there is negative 7. All right. Now, the next one is, let's say, negative 4 plus negative 3 plus 2 plus negative 3. What would this equal to? Well, again, we have a parenthesis here. We can't just ignore it. We have to go and do what's inside of here first. So we say negative 3 plus 2. These are different signs, so we have to basically follow this rule over here. We cover up the signs. We have 3 minus 2. We always subtract. 3 minus 2 is 1. And what we get here, the sign of it matches the sign of the larger number, in this case negative. So we have negative 1 there. So really what we have is negative 4 from here plus a negative 1. So I'll do it like this, plus a negative 1. And over here we have plus a negative 3. Like this. All right. And so let me go and continue on over here. Negative 4 plus a negative 1. Negative 4 plus a negative 1. We have two signs. We just go left to right at this point. We have two signs that are the same. So we add these together. We get 5. The answer is going to be negative because negative plus negative is always negative. And then we have our negative 3 that we still need to add to it. So we add this guy here. These two signs are the same, so we're going to get a negative. We add them together, and we get an 8. So anytime you're adding or subtracting, or I should say adding things together with the same sign, you go ahead and add them, but the sign basically matches the sign of what you're adding together. So negative plus negative gives us negative. You add them together. The final answer is going to be negative 8 here. One more thing I'll say, I mean, this is the answer. I'll just circle it. But I'll just say while I'm pointing out, you see, you could rewrite this to make it a little clearer to understand what's going on here. Negative 4 plus a negative 1 is the same as negative 4 minus 1. And then this plus a negative 3 is the same as minus 3. So these are the same exact things. There's no difference between what I've written here and what I've written here. It's just a different way of writing it on the paper, but it represents the same thing. You start at negative 4 and you subtract 1, you're going to get to negative 5. That's what we got here. Negative 5, and you subtract 3 more, you're going to go left more, and that's going to give you negative 8. All right, so let's do something a little bit different. Let's say we have a negative absolute value of negative 9 plus negative 3, close the absolute value off, plus negative 6. Okay, so here, this is a little bit different because we have some math we have to do that's inside of an absolute value, and then we have some other stuff on the outside. So when you see something like this, you kind of treat this absolute value as parentheses. You have to do what's inside of it first before you can do anything else. All right, so let's go ahead and do that first. We have negative 9 plus a negative 3, which is the same we've been talking about as negative 9 minus 3, right? So if we follow our rules, negative plus negative is always going to give us negative. 9 plus 3 is always going to give us 12. So the answer inside of there is negative 12. So if we rewrite what we have here, what we have is negative on the outside, absolute value. Inside we found the answer to be negative 12. Close the absolute value off, plus negative 6. Or you could also write it as minus 6. It's the same thing either way. Okay? Over here, what we have here, the absolute value of negative 12 is going to give us positive 12. So this guy right here gives us positive 12, but there's another negative outside. So really what we get in the end is still a negative 12. Make sure you understand that. This inside, this absolute value is going to return a positive 12, but we have a negative out front, so we get negative 12. Plus a negative 6, we can write that as minus 6. It's the same thing as writing plus a negative 6. So here, what we have, since we're adding together these guys, in this case we have negative 12 plus a negative 6. We're adding together two negative numbers, so the answer is going to be negative, and we basically just add the absolute values together. 12 plus 6 is going to give you 18, and the answer is negative 18. And that makes sense because if you think about it as subtraction, then negative 12, and then you subtract 6 more, you're going to go to the left 6 more, and that's going to give you the negative 18. So it's kind of however you like to think about it. I'm trying to give you multiple different ways and lots of examples to be able to find your own way. Okay? Now let's crank it up a little bit. Not going to be hard, but we'll change things a little bit. Let's say absolute value of 3/5. That's a fraction, 3/5, plus negative 4/5. You know, a lot of students, when they look at this, they'll have no idea what to do, because not only do you have absolute value, which scares some people, but you have negative and positive, you know, things going on. That scares a lot of people. And then you have fractions. Fractions terrify people a lot of times, but we've already talked about how to deal with fractions. We've already talked about how to deal with absolute value, and now we're learning how to deal with negative numbers. So putting them all together is not that hard to do. So let's go ahead and do that. What we need to do is realize at a bigger level, all we're doing is adding two things together. One's positive and one's negative. That's all we're doing. So the same rules apply to everything else we've done. It doesn't matter if these are fractions. The same rules apply. So what we really have, okay, is we have an absolute value. We haven't done anything with that. We need to figure out the inside. Here, since we're adding two things together with different signs, we ignore the sign. So we ignore this guy, and we basically subtract these guys from one another. So what's going to happen if you have 3/5, or I should say, let's do 4/5 minus 3/5. It doesn't matter which way you subtract it, but once you cover it up, you just subtract the bigger one from the smaller one, or the bigger one minus the smaller one. So in this case, we have 4/5, cover this stuff up, minus 3/5. That's going to give us 1/5. But we need to make sure that it takes the sign of whatever is bigger. Which fraction is bigger here? Do you think 3 out of 5 pieces is bigger, or 4 out of 5 pieces is bigger? 4 out of 5 pieces is the bigger number. So this guy takes the sign of this larger number. So make sure you understand that. This is no different than everything we've done before. All we did is cover up the signs and subtract these things to get from one another. So just like we were doing in the previous board. In this case, it's 4/5 minus 3/5. 4 minus 1 is 1, and it's over 5 because it's fraction subtraction. And then we have to keep the sign of the larger number. That's all we've done in every problem so far. So it takes it as a negative number. Now this is easy. The absolute value of a negative number is just the number itself. You take the sign away. So we're going to have positive 1/5. All right? So let's go and do something with decimals. Let's say we have negative 5.2 plus the absolute value of negative 2.5 plus negative 4, like this. All right, so again, I told you, when you see absolute value, if there's more than one thing going on in here, you really need to treat it like a parenthesis, basically. So you want to do what's inside of it first. So let's go and figure this out. Here we have negative 2.5 plus a negative 4. We're adding two negative numbers together. So the answer is always going to be negative. All right, negative plus negative gives you negative. To get the number, you just add the numbers. And what you get, 4 plus 2.5 is 6.5. So what we do now is rewrite what we have. Negative 5.2, and then we have plus the absolute value of negative 6.5. All right, so the next thing is pretty obvious what we need to do. We have an absolute value here. So we have negative 5.2. The absolute value of this is just plus 6.5, like this. And so now we have to add these numbers together. One is negative, one is positive. So since the signs are different, we always just ignore the sign and subtract the numbers. 6.5 minus 5.2 is just basically going to give you 1.3. And the sign of the answer always takes the sign of the larger number. In this case, it's positive. So it's positive 1.3. So whenever you see two things that are different and you're adding them together, different signs, you ignore the sign, you subtract them, larger to smaller, just like first grade, get a number, and the sign of it always takes the sign of whichever number is actually larger. And that's the final answer there. All right, now what we're going to do is continue working on addition of negative and positive numbers, also called real numbers. And this time we're going to introduce a little bit of algebra and a little bit of variables into the mix here. So what we're going to do for these problems is not hard, but what I'm going to do is write down a few things. I'm going to say to you to basically take as fact that the variable x is equal to 2, the variable y is equal to negative 3, the variable z is equal to negative 4, and the variable u is equal to 5. And what we're going to do is work a few problems where we're dealing with x's and y's and z's and u's. Now, when you see variables in algebra, variable is just a letter. Now, a lot of times you see that and a lot of students seize up, you know, they don't know what to do. There's a letter there. Letters are just part of the alphabet. You've been dealing with letters probably before you were ever dealing with numbers, right? Or at least so long ago, letters should not scare you. When you see a letter in math, it just means that you don't know what that value is equal to. You know, I may be solving a problem where I'm trying to calculate the temperature in this room, but I don't know what the temperature is. So I might call it T, temperature T, right? T for temperature. And then I might do all my calculations and I find out that T is equal to 80 degrees or T is equal to 75 degrees. So I've solved for the answer I wanted with T. T is temperature, right? In this case, there's some variable x, and there's some variable y, and there's some variable z, and there's some variable u, but I already know what they're equal to ahead of time here in this particular example, just because I'm trying to get you used to the idea of seeing letters in terms of algebra. So when you see them, don't freak out. In this case, we know what they're equal to. Now, since we know what they are, let's calculate a few things. What would x plus y equal to? A lot of students would look at x plus y and suddenly get scared because it's, oh my gosh, it's letters. This is nothing hard. You know what x is equal to. It's equal to 2. You know what y is equal to. It's equal to negative 3. So all you do is you substitute in the values that you know from what you see up here as defined on the board, and then you calculate the answer. So here x is 2, so you literally put 2 plus y is negative 3. So we just say negative 3. So you see all we've done is we've taken what we know and we've substituted in there. Now we're dealing purely with numbers and we can calculate the answer here because we've been doing that all along. Here we're adding two things together with different signs. So we cover up the signs, we subtract 3 minus 2 gives us 1. The answer there, the sign there is going to match the sign of the larger number. In this case it's going to be negative because the bigger number here is 3. So the answer there is negative 1. So when you see any kind of deal where you're trying to substitute in, you just literally put those numbers where they go. So here we have x plus u plus 3. So here we have x, there's a 2. Remember to keep the parentheses around because you have to match it exactly as it's written. Plus u. U is defined to be 5 plus 3. So all we have done is taken what we know and put it into our problem. And now it's very easy. 2 plus 5, we always do what's inside the parentheses first. 2 plus 5 is 7 plus 3. 7 plus 3 is 10. And that is our answer. Notice we have positive plus positive gives us positive. Here we had positive plus positive. That gave us positive. So we're using all of the rules that we have learned up to this point in algebra. It's just that, for positive numbers, you already know those from when you were a little kid. All right, now let's look at another one. Let's say we have x plus z plus u plus z. What would this be equal to? Well, we just substitute in. X is 2, so we'll have a 2 here. Z is over here, -4. It's plus a -4. Let's do it as -4. Just keep it clean like this. So this is 2 plus a -4. And then we add to that whatever's in here. U plus z. U is 5 plus z is -4. So make sure you understand that. We have kept everything intact. We just put the numbers in wherever we needed to. So what is this here? If we do what's inside of this parenthesis first. 2 plus a -4. We have different signs. So in order to get the answer, we ignore the signs. We subtract. 4 minus 2 is 2. The sign of the answer takes the sign of the bigger number. In that case, it takes a negative sign. And then over here, we are adding together two things with different signs. So we ignore the signs and subtract. 5 minus 4 is 1, and it takes the sign of the bigger number. So in this case, it takes a positive, like this. So when we rewrite everything, what we have is -2 from there, plus 1. -2 plus 1. And to get the answer here, we're adding together two things that have different signs. So we ignore the sign, we subtract 2 minus 1 is 1, and we take the sign of the larger number, which is negative. So we get an answer of -1 there. All right, let me go and erase this, and we'll do a few more where we're basically going to substitute these same numbers into our problem. Here, this is an exercise in learning how to add, basically learning how to add negative, positive numbers. The letters here are just trying to get you comfortable with seeing some letters in algebra and how to substitute in the values of these variables into your problem. All right, let's say we have x plus, and inside this bracket here we have 5 plus y plus u, close parentheses, close bracket. And this is what we're trying to do. First thing we need to do is substitute in for everything that we have. So we know that x is equal to 2, so that's going to go out here. So I'll put it like an equal sign here. And then we have on the inside, we have a 5 plus, inside here we have a y, which is -3, plus u, which is 5. Close and close, like this. All right, now we need to figure out what to do next. We have a bracket, but then we have parentheses inside the bracket. And when we do order of operations, we always go to the most inside parentheses first and do that first and work our way out. So we have to go in here first and do this first. -3 plus 5. We're adding together two things with different signs. So we ignore the sign. We subtract 5 minus 3 and get 2. And then the sign of the answer takes the sign of the bigger number, in this case positive. So we get a +2 here. So if we're going to rewrite this, let me switch colors. If we rewrite our problem here, we have 2 plus, we'll open the bracket, here we have 5 plus, this entire parentheses is actually 2. This looks much, much simpler, does it not? Okay, so inside of here, 5 plus 2, I think you would agree, is just simply 7. And so the answer we get is 2 plus 7, which is 9. So the answer is 9. And you see, you're just taking it one step at a time. You're substituting in, you're doing inside parentheses, working your way out, and you're taking it and you're tackling it logically. See, math is all about logic. It's all about learning the rules and then applying the rules in sequence. If you don't learn the rules, then you can't get the answers right. It's just impossible. All right, so next, let's say we have absolute value of 2x plus y. We'll close the absolute value off. So let's go ahead and substitute in what we know. 2 times x, x is 2. So I'll put a 2 here. I'll put a parentheses to mean multiplication. 2 with a parentheses like this, it just means you're multiplying these together. And then I'm going to add y in, which is -3. All right, like this. Now, order of operations tells us we have to do what's inside of the absolute value first, and it also tells us is that if we're looking in here and we have multiplication and we have addition, we always do the multiplication first. So what is 2 times 2? Ladies and gentlemen, 2 times 2 is just 4, okay? So what we really have is absolute value of 4 plus -3, like this. This is what we really have. And then if we're trying to deal with what's inside of here first, what is 4 plus a negative 3? We're adding together two things with different signs. So we ignore the sign, we subtract 4 minus 3 and we get 1, and we take the sign of the larger number, which is positive. So at the end of the day, what we have is absolute value of 1, which is simply 1. When you do the absolute value, you just take the sign away. This was already positive to begin with, and so you get that answer. We'll erase the board and we'll do a couple more here to show you how to get more practice. All right, so what we have here is absolute value of x plus z, we'll close the absolute value off, plus another absolute value, x plus y plus z, close this guy off. So, it looks complicated, lots of letters, lots of absolute values. You know, before you started this lesson, that might worry you a little bit, but it's not hard because we just substitute in. X is 2, plus z here is negative 4. So I'll put negative 4, close the absolute value off, and then the other guy I'll open. X is 2, y is negative 3, z is negative 4, like this. So here we have x plus z, here we have x plus y plus z. Okay, and so let's go ahead and do what's inside of here, right here. And so what we'll have is adding two things together with different signs. So we ignore the signs. 4 minus 2 gives you 2. This is going to take the sign of the larger number. So what we're actually going to have is negative 2 there. All right, now inside of here, we really need to do everything inside of here, right? Because this is all inside of the absolute value. But when we have addition like this, we're going to go left to right, and this is all from order of operations. So first we're going to add these two numbers, and then we're going to add the last one. You know, this is just like 2 plus 3 plus 4. When you add them all together, you add the first two, 2 plus 3, you can get that answer, and then you add 4. You just keep adding left to right, right? So we're doing the exact same thing here. So let's go ahead and do this one first. 2 plus a negative 3. They're different, so we ignore the signs. 3 minus 2 gives me 1, and it takes the sign of the larger number. So that actually turns out to be negative 1. So now, if we go and try to do the whole thing, since we know that this is actually negative 1, it's really negative 1 plus negative 4. So how do we do negative 1 plus negative 4? Well, they're both negative, right? So the answer is always going to be negative, and since they're both negative, we add them together. 1 plus 4 is 5. So the answer to this whole thing inside there is negative 5. So if you're going to rewrite it, it would be absolute value of negative 2 plus absolute value of negative 5. What's the absolute value of negative 2? You just take the sign away. Absolute value of negative 5, you take the sign away. 2 plus 5 is 7. So the answer is positive 7. All right, now up until this point, we've mostly done addition, right? We've talked about the fact that the title of this section is adding and subtracting negative and positive numbers, or adding and subtracting real numbers. Now, I've kind of showed you how subtraction can be written as plus minus, you know, adding a negative number, right? But we really haven't done too much subtraction in this section so far. We've pretty much been adding numbers together. Either we're adding two positive numbers like this and getting a positive number, or we're adding two negative numbers together, always getting a negative number, or we're adding two different sign numbers, and then the sign of the answer is going to depend on the problem. And that's basically what we've done up to this point. Here I want to briefly show you, just digging a little bit deeper into the subtraction side. What you've kind of learned already is that addition and subtraction are basically the same thing. Because when you introduce negative numbers, since negative numbers already have that little negative sign out front, a lot of times you can write it as subtraction. I've kind of tried to demystify that as we go along here. Here we're going to kind of dig into that area just a little bit more to make you even more comfortable with that part of it. So just to kind of start out, we'll start out with a super easy problem. You know, from first grade. Let's say we have 8 minus 4. 8 minus 4. Well, you know what the answer to this is. You know the answer is 4 because you have 8 pencils, you take 4 away, and you get 4. But this is really exactly the same thing as what we've been doing earlier. 8 plus negative 4, right? It's exactly the same thing because I told you anytime you have plus a negative sign, you can write it as subtraction. Right? And I've done that a few times to kind of just point that out to you. And if you use the rules of what we've been doing here, you have different signs you're adding together, positive plus negative. So you ignore and you subtract them. 8 minus 4 is going to give you 4, and the answer takes the sign of the larger number. In this case, it's positive. So you get positive number here and positive 4 here, And that matches because I'm telling you that they're both the same thing. We've done that several times. So you can kind of see how addition of a negative can sort of be turned into subtraction. I'm telling you this so that if you see a problem written like this, you know what to do. And if you see a problem written like this, you know what to do. You can kind of convert back and forth, whatever makes you more comfortable. It's kind of up to you. Now let's, change things up a little bit. What if you have something like -8 minus 4? It's the same problem as what we have above, except for the fact that I have a -8 subtracting 4, and here I had a +8 subtracting 4. Well, if you think about it in terms of your number line, if I start out at -8 and I subtract 4 more, then I'm going to be going to the left 4 units. So it would be starting from -8, -9, -10, -11, -12. And that is the answer. But this can also be rewritten exactly in terms of what we've been doing before as -8 plus -4. Because anytime you have plus a negative number, it's the same thing as subtraction. And if you use the rules that we've been using this whole time for this problem, you should get the same thing. Since we have a negative plus a negative, the answer you're going to get is always negative. And when they have the same sign like this, you just add them together and you get 12. So you get -12 either way. Two different ways of thinking about the exact same problem. So let me show you a case that we haven't gotten to yet though, because the problems I've given you deliberately haven't gotten you into this territory. What if you have 8 minus -4? This is a problem we have not done up till now. I've given you problems where you're subtracting positive numbers or when you're adding negative numbers like this, but I've never given you a problem where you're subtracting a negative number. I haven't given you that problem. And so here's how you handle it. Basically, anytime you see subtraction of a negative number, what you do is you kind of, on your paper, you write it as 8 plus 4. In other words, when you have a negative and a negative sitting right next to each other, you can kind of put a plus and a plus here, and that's called adding the opposite. So 8 minus -4 is really the same thing as 8 plus 4. And what is 8 plus 4? 8 plus 4 is 12, positive 12, of course. And that's the answer. So make sure you understand that. You might hear your teacher say, or you might see your book say, add the opposite, add the opposite, add the opposite. What does add the opposite mean? It only pops up when you're subtracting a negative number. When you have these two negative signs, this double negative here, sitting right next to each other, they're kind of sort of cancel each other out, and so you can basically make them both positive, and it changes it back into addition, so it makes it easier. And an easy way for you to remember this is, like I said, two negatives sitting next together, it's kind of like a double negative. You have the same thing in English. If you say something, you might say, I don't want to go to school. What does that mean? It means you don't want to go, right? You might say, I never want to go to school. I never want to go to school. Well, that means you don't want to go, basically, right? But what if you write a sentence that isn't quite right, is the following. I don't never want to go to school. I don't never want to go to school. What does that mean? Well, that's not good English. You shouldn't write a sentence like that. That's called a double negative, right? And we're taught not to write sentences like that. Why? Because when you say, I don't never want to go to school, the don't and the never kind of cancel each other out. So when you don't never want to go, it kind of means you do want to go, right? They kind of annihilate each other. I don't never want to go fishing. I don't never want to get a lollipop. It means I really do want a lollipop because I don't never want to get it. So I kind of cancel it out. So anytime I have, just like don't never, anytime you have two negatives sitting next to each other like this, it makes it positive. It changes the meaning of what you're doing, basically, like this. So make sure you understand that. And that happens, for all problems like this. If you have 2 minus a -1, then the way you do this is you basically say, I change this from a negative to a positive, negative to a positive, I add the opposite. 2 minus a -1 is basically going to be 2 plus 1, which is 3. Right? 10 minus a -3, right? Anytime I have those two negative signs sitting next to each other, I can add the opposite, and that's going to be 10 plus 3 is 13. So anytime I have a negative sitting next to another negative, I can add the opposite, I can change it back into addition and go into there. And now that you've kind of seen this one case where you're subtracting a negative number, you've seen everything there is to know about adding and subtracting negative numbers. Okay, what if you have, just to kind of go back to something that we've touched on earlier, what if you have negative 12 minus 5, right? Negative 12 minus 5. Well, you start at negative 12, you go 5 units to the left, then it's negative 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. It's going to be negative 17. This is exactly the same thing as negative 12 plus negative 5. Exactly the same thing. You're adding two items that are the same, so you get a negative sign, and you add the numbers together, 17, like this. So anytime you see plus next to a minus, you can just treat it as subtraction. Anytime you see minus next to a minus, you can treat it as addition. Basically, you kind of cancel them out like that. Okay? And it's the same thing that we've learned, you know, like in 3rd grade math. You know, if you have 3 minus 2, the answer that you're going to get is 1. It's exactly the same thing as 3 plus a negative 2. Basically, I have 3 pencils. I owe somebody 2 pencils. So when I add them together, what am I going to be left with? Only 1 pencil. Once I pay back the 2 people that I owe, I'm only going to have 1 thing left. And if I have something like 0, you know, ice cream cones, and I subtract a negative 5 ice cream cones, then basically because I have nothing and then I subtract a negative number, it's the same thing as adding the opposite. So what I have is 0 plus 5 is 5 ice cream cones. So if I start with nothing but I subtract a negative number of ice creams, those two things kind of cancel and I actually end up with 5 ice cream cones in the end. Now, doing more of this subtraction business, dealing with fractions, you might see something like 5/3 minus 7/6. It's subtraction. The only difference is that you have some fractions here. Now, we've talked about fractions before. We can't do the subtraction right away because we do not have common denominators. So let's take a few minutes to make these denominators the same. So we'll have 5/3 minus 7/6. Okay, so I see a 3 on the bottom and a 6 on the bottom. The easiest way to make these guys common is to multiply that by 2 and multiply the top by 2, because then that'll give me 6 on the bottom. So what I'll have is 10 over 6 minus 7 over 6. And then when I have 10 minus, the way I can subtract these fractions, since these are the same denominator, the denominator will stay the same, and then 10 minus 7 is going to give me 3/6. And you always check to see if this is a reduced fraction. We've talked about fractions in the previous section. I can divide the top by 3, and I can divide the bottom by 3. And when I do that, 3 divided by 3 on the top is 1. 6 divided by 3 on the bottom is 2. So it's 1/2. So what we had to do is combine a few different concepts. We wanted to subtract these numbers. We had to get the common denominator in order to do it. And we just do the subtraction as we normally do. And then we go ahead and simplify the fraction by dividing top and bottom by 2. Let me close, or I should say divide the top and the bottom of this fraction by 3. Let me go ahead and close this section off by doing a kind of a larger problem that will involve subtracting. Let's say we have 3 minus, and then we have a bracket, negative 4 minus 3. Like this, all right? So what do we do here? Well, we have a bracket, right? So we need to do what's inside of that first before we can do anything else. So here we have negative 4 minus 3. Negative 4 minus 3. So what we know we're going to have is a negative answer because we're starting with negative 4. We're going more to the left. We're going to go 3 units to the left, so it'll be negative 5, negative 6, negative 7. Negative 7 like this. Another way to remember it is, subtraction can be written as plus a negative. So this is really negative 4 plus a negative 3. So we're basically adding 2 negative numbers here. The answer will be negative 4 plus 3 is going to give us 7. All right? And then what we'll have, since we know this is now negative 7, we'll have a 3 minus, and on the inside we'll have a negative 7. And since we just learned that anytime you have a negative sitting next to another negative like this, you can add the opposite. So what you're going to have is 3 plus 7, which is just simply 10. And that is the answer. That's the final answer. So there's a lot of things you had to do in this problem. We wanted to do the inside first, we know we have negative 4 minus 3, so we had to do that subtraction. You can think of it in terms of subtraction, moving left on the number line, or you can think of it in terms of adding a negative 3, which we've done many times. We get that guy here, and then we have to add the opposite to get back and figure out how to deal with these two negative signs together, and then we can go ahead and end up with the final answer. All right, let's just do a couple more here, and we'll call it a day. Let's say we have 5 minus 3 plus 3 minus 5. All right? So the first one here, we have to do what's inside the parentheses first. The first one here is really easy because 5 minus 3 is what we've done from first grade. That's just 2, okay? The second one is 3 minus 5. That can give students some problems at first, but then you realize that when you have subtraction like this, it's really the same as 3 plus a negative 5. 3 plus a negative 5. That means we're basically adding numbers together with different signs. So we ignore the sign for a second, and we subtract. 5 minus 3 is 2. The sign that we get is going to be the sign of the bigger number. In this case, we have a negative 5 here and positive 3. So we just take the sign of the larger number. This can be written, in other words, as 3 plus a negative 5. We've been doing those all together, for the whole time. So if it's easier for you to think of it that way, do so. You get negative 2. If you can think of a number line and think of you being over here at positive 3 and you go 5 units to the left, that would be 2, 1, 0, negative 1, negative 2. That's going to be your answer. Either way you want to think about it is fine. So what we have here is 2 plus negative 2, which, since we've learned now, plus a negative is just simply subtraction. 2 minus 2 is what? 0. So the answer is 0. Same as 2 minus 2. All right, final problem. 5 minus, open a bracket, 4 plus negative 2, close bracket, minus 5, close the outer bracket. That's what we want to simplify. So what do? Well, we have a giant bracket here, so we know we need to do what's inside of here first. We have a lot of addition and subtraction. So according to order of operations, we go left to right inside of the bracket first. So the first thing we work on is these first guys here and try to just do that. 4 plus a negative 2, which is, by the way, the same thing as 4 minus 2. So you know from thinking of it that way, the answer is just going to be 2. But if you didn't remember that plus minus is basically going to give you 4 minus 2, if you didn't remember that, then you could say, okay, I'm adding together two things that are different signs. So I ignore the signs and subtract. 4 minus 2 is 2. The sign of the answer is the sign of the larger number. That's why it's positive. So what we're going to actually have is 5 from out here minus, open a bracket. This is 2, and I have 2 minus 5 like this. So now I need to do what's inside this bracket, 2 minus 5. And you can do it any way you'd like. But the way I like to think about it is, just to kind of give you a little bit of variety, 2 minus 5. If I'm on the number line over here at positive 2 and I go 5 units to the left, where am I going to land? I'm going to go 5 units. So starting at 2, it's going to be 1, 0, negative 1, negative 2, negative 3. So the answer is going to be negative 3. I just count 5 units to the left. If that confuses you, no problem. Subtraction is always adding a negative number. So what this really is, another way of saying this, right here, is 2 plus negative 5. So since I'm adding two numbers with different signs, I ignore the signs and I do the subtraction. 5 minus 2 is 3. The sign is going to take the sign of the larger number, which is negative. So either way you want to think about subtraction, if you want to change it back to addition, if you're more comfortable with that, great. If you're more comfortable thinking in terms of moving to the left in the number line, that's fine too. So finally, I'm going to have 5 minus, and inside of this bracket, a negative 3. Now we invoke what we just learned a minute ago. We have subtracting a negative number, which is the same thing as adding the opposite. So what we have is 5 plus 3. Finally, 5 plus 3 is 8. And the final answer is 8. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how you add and subtract real numbers in algebra. I cannot stress enough how important it is that you master this. Not just so-so, not just okay, but you have to know it. And the only way you're going to know it is to practice. So if you've just watched this video through and haven't actually picked your pencil up, then that's wonderful. Hopefully you've understood anything. Hopefully you've understood lots of stuff. Go back to the beginning of this section, watch it again. Pause the video every time you see a problem go up and work it out yourself. It doesn't matter if you've seen these problems before. That's fine. Watch it again. Make sure you can get every one of these answers as you go through it, and continue watching the video. You know, if you're not getting all the answers correct, continue watching it and practicing. A lot of people still need practice even after watching this video, so go get my companion worksheets. Make sure you can do all of those problems. Or you can go back to the pre-algebra tutor and practice even more with adding and subtracting negative and positive numbers. But no matter what you do, you really have to get it right, because later on, see, now we're dealing with numbers. These are things you can kind of visualize. Later on, we'll be adding and subtracting variables with letters. It's going to be a little harder for you to kind of know intuitively what to do, so you need to get a good grounding here. Make sure you understand how to do this material, and then follow me on to the next section where we'll learn how to multiply and divide negative and positive numbers.